had trusted Richard with everything. My money, my time, my heart. I never imagined he would betray me like this. Looking back now, I can see the subtle signs I missed, the quiet moments that should have rung alarms in my mind. But at the time, I believed in him completely. I believed in our friendship as if it were a sacred promise, unbreakable and eternal. Richard and I met when I was barely 20. He had that mischievous smile even then, one that made you believe in him instantly. I was young, idealistic, eager to make friends who would last a lifetime, and he filled that space perfectly. We shared dreams, laughter, and a curiosity about life that made every conversation feel like an adventure. Over the decades, our lives intertwined in ways that were hard to separate. Holidays spent together, celebrations, small victories, even heartbreaks. He was my confidant, my companion in the quiet and loud moments alike. As I grew older, I trusted him not just with my stories and my secrets, but with the life I had built. I had saved diligently, planned carefully, and thought I was securing a comfortable future for myself. And in Richard, I saw a man I could share those dreams with. Not as a partner, not as a lover, but as someone whose loyalty I never doubted. For years I helped him in small ways. I invested in his ideas when he asked for advice, lent him money when he needed it, always under the belief that he would pay me back in time. I didn't just invest in his projects. I invested in him. I believed in his vision, his charm, his intellect. And I believed that we were partners in a friendship that had weathered decades of life's storms. I remember the first time he asked me for a significant loan. I was hesitant, of course, cautious after all these years, but his eyes held a kind of earnestness I couldn't deny. He spoke of a business he wanted to start, something that would secure his future and, in some way, honor our long friendship. He said the right words, the kind of words that made you believe that this was more than just money changing hands. It was a step toward something bigger, something meaningful. And I gave it to him, all of it, trusting that he would honor our bond. At the time, I didn't think twice. I didn't calculate risk or imagine deceit. I only saw the man who had been there for me in the darkest hours of my life, the man who had laughed with me until our sides ached, the man who had celebrated every success as if it were his own. That man, I thought, would never betray me. In the early years, everything seemed fine. Richard's business ventures grew, slowly but steadily. He would call, tell me about his progress, and I would feel a quiet pride swelling in my chest. I would listen to his dreams, offer advice, and watch from the sidelines as he built something of his own. I felt involved, connected, as if my faith in him had been a small but important part of his journey. But as the years went by, small things began to shift. I noticed it at first in the subtleties of our conversations. Richard started evading questions about finances, about how the business was doing. He would laugh off inquiries, claim that everything was fine, that I shouldn't worry. And foolishly I accepted it. After all, this was Richard, the man I had trusted with my life. How could I doubt him? There were other little signs too. Calls that came late at night, excuses for delays, sudden bursts of defensiveness that seemed uncharacteristic. I told myself that perhaps he was stressed, that running a business was not easy, that I should be patient. I gave him the benefit of the doubt again and again, because my trust in him was too deep to let go at the first hint of trouble. Meanwhile, I continued my own quiet life. At 68, I was no longer chasing dreams. I was preserving what I had built, living with dignity and modest comfort. I spent time with family, tended to my home, and cherished quiet afternoons reading or sipping tea by the window. And yet, Richard remained a constant presence in my thoughts. Even in the mundane rhythm of my days, I would anticipate his messages, his visits, his laughter that once felt like sunlight. I remember one particular afternoon, sitting in my sunlit living room, the walls lined with photographs of a life well lived. There I was, young and full of hope, standing beside Richard at a graduation, a birthday party, a long-forgotten summer picnic. Each picture a testament to years of shared history. And I realized in that quiet moment how much of my life I had intertwined with his. Not out of necessity, but out of choice. I had chosen to trust him with more than money, more than time. I had chosen to trust him with pieces of my very soul. Looking back, I realized that trust is a fragile thing, like glass, beautiful, valuable, and devastating when broken. I never imagined that someone could take something so sacred and shatter it so completely. At the time, all I knew was a sense of loyalty, a comfort in the constancy of his presence. I never stopped to question why, after all these years, My finances seemed inexplicably tight, while promises of repayment seemed increasingly vague, while little questions about numbers or accounts were met with irritation or deflection. There was a warmth in our friendship, a glow that made the idea of betrayal inconceivable. I clung to that warmth, to the comforting illusion that Richard was the man I had known all my life. I didn't see the cracks in the foundation until it was too late. Until the day I realized that what I thought was a shared journey was, in fact, a one-sided illusion. The day the truth began to dawn was unremarkable at first. I sat at my desk, reviewing bills, looking over statements, noting discrepancies I had previously ignored. At first, I thought it must be a mistake. Banks make mistakes, numbers get transposed. But then the pattern emerged, undeniable and stark. My savings, painstakingly accumulated over decades, were gone, transferred, spent, leveraged in ways I had never authorized. And at the center of it all was Richard, the man I had trusted implicitly. Shock is a curious thing. At first it numbs you. You can't reconcile the warmth of decades-long friendship with the cold, harsh reality staring you in the face. I stared at the statements over and over, my hands trembling, my heart pounding. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't speak. How could he? How could Richard, after everything, betray me in such a calculated, deliberate way? I don't know how long I sat there, lost in disbelief. The room around me blurred as memories flashed. Long walks in the park, laughter over shared jokes, quiet evenings discussing life, hopes, fears. Every memory now carried a sharp edge, a betrayal hidden beneath its surface. And yet, even in that moment of devastation, there was a small, stubborn flame inside me, whispering that this could not be the end. That somehow, I would find a way to reclaim what was mine. Not just my money, but my dignity, my sense of justice, my faith in myself. Because that is the thing about betrayal. It is deeply personal. It cuts not just into your wallet, but into your heart, your trust, your very identity. And I realized then, sitting alone in the quiet of my living room, that I would not let Richard define the end of my story. The days following my discovery were the longest of my life. Every time I thought I understood the scope of Richard's actions, another detail would surface, each one sharper than the last. I tried, futilely, to convince myself that there must be some reasonable explanation. A banking error, a clerical mistake, something innocent. But deep down, I knew the truth, and it burned like an unquenchable fire. I remember the first time I confronted him, or at least tried to. I called Richard one crisp morning, my hands trembling slightly as I held the phone. My voice wavered, betraying the anger I tried so desperately to contain. "Richard," I said, trying to keep my tone calm, "I noticed some discrepancies in my accounts. Can you explain this?" There was a pause on the other end. A pause I should have recognized, a pause that should have set off alarms in my mind. But the warmth of familiarity, the comfort of decades-long friendship, made me doubt my instincts. He chuckled softly, a sound meant to soothe, to disarm. "Eleanor, you worry too much. You always do. Everything's fine, I promise. Don't let it trouble you." And I wanted to believe him. God, I wanted to believe him. Over the next few weeks, I watched him carefully, paying attention to every word, every gesture, every tiny detail. Richard was a master at charm, at concealing intent behind smiles and easy laughter. But beneath it all, I began to see a subtle pattern. The evasion, the half-truths, the stories that didn't quite add up. I noticed it in the way he avoided eye contact when certain topics arose, the way his tone would sharpen ever so slightly when I pressed too hard. He would deflect questions with humor, with flattery, with stories of past adventures. And yet, the knot in my stomach tightened each time, whispering that something was terribly wrong. I began to dig deeper. I pored over statements, receipts, emails, trying to piece together a puzzle I never imagined I'd have to solve. Every answer led to more questions. The sum of my life's work, the careful savings, the investments I had made for decades, had somehow vanished into Richard's pockets. And worse, he had used it to build his own life, his own comfort, while I struggled to understand how this had happened right under my nose. One afternoon, I sat at my kitchen table, a stack of papers in front of me, my heart pounding in my chest. I had traced wire transfers, documented discrepancies, and noted transactions that made no sense. The pattern was clear. Richard had been siphoning off funds slowly, carefully, with the precision of someone who knew they would not be caught. The betrayal was methodical, intentional, and utterly cruel. I felt a mix of rage and grief. Emotions so intense they left me shaking. Rage at the man I had loved as a friend, and grief for the years of trust, the years of believing in someone who had never deserved it. I thought about all the times I had defended him, vouched for him, celebrated him, and my chest ached with the weight of it. How had I been so blind? How had I not seen the signs? And then came the phone calls. Friends, distant family, people who had known me for years, calling with concerns about Richard's business and the sudden improvements in his lifestyle. They spoke cautiously, as if testing the waters, but it was enough to confirm my worst fears. Richard had indeed used my money to fund his own ventures, to create a life of comfort and security for himself while leaving me in the shadows of financial uncertainty. I tried to confront him again, this time with evidence. I sent emails outlining the transfers, screenshots of statements, a timeline of the missing funds. His response was the same charming deflection, the same practiced innocence. "Eleanor, you're mistaken," he said, his tone light, almost teasing. "I would never do anything to hurt you. You know that. Let's talk in person." I agreed, even though part of me wanted to scream at the thought of seeing him. I wanted the confrontation, yet feared it at the same time. I wanted to hear him admit it, to feel the truth in his words, but I dreaded the realization that the man I had trusted most in the world had been lying to me for years. The day we met, I was calm on the surface, but inside, I was a storm of emotions. Richard greeted me with his usual smile, a practiced charm that had once felt comforting but now made my skin crawl. We sat in the small cafe we had frequented for years, the walls lined with familiar pictures, the air scented with coffee and pastries. It should have been a place of warmth and nostalgia, but it was anything but. I laid out the evidence. Each paper, each transaction, each discrepancy presented like a dagger aimed straight at the heart of our friendship. Richard listened, nodding, occasionally offering a small, almost believable chuckle. He claimed there had been misunderstandings, errors, miscommunications, but the lie was too thick, too rehearsed, too convenient. I could feel my resolve hardening with every word. Finally, I could no longer contain the tremor in my voice. "Richard," I said, my eyes locked on his, "this isn't a mistake. You stole from me. Every cent, every penny I trusted you with. You used it to build your own life while leaving me to face the consequences." His eyes flickered, just for a moment, a tiny crack in the carefully constructed mask. But then he smiled, that same disarming smile, and said, "Eleanor, you're overreacting. Let's not let emotions ruin years of friendship." It was at that moment I realized that no words, no pleas, no evidence would break through to him. The man I had known, the friend I had trusted, was gone. In his place was someone I did not recognize, someone who had calculated every move, every transfer, every word, to protect himself while leaving me betrayed. I left the cafe that day with a heavy heart. The world felt colder, emptier, and I felt more alone than I had in decades. But beneath the despair, a spark of determination ignited. I would not let Richard walk away with my life, with my dignity. I would find a way to reclaim what was rightfully mine. I would expose the betrayal, no matter how long it took, no matter the obstacles. Over the next few weeks, I began to plan. I consulted financial advisors, legal experts, and even private investigators. I gathered every scrap of evidence, every record, every testimony I could find. It was painstaking, exhausting work, but with each document and each conversation, the weight on my chest lightened just a little. I was taking control, slowly but surely, of the chaos Richard had created. And yet, even as I built my strategy, the emotional toll was immense. I had trusted him completely, loved him as a friend, and now faced the bitter reality that betrayal had come from the one person I had believed in most. Sleep became difficult, my mind restless with memories and plans. I oscillated between grief, anger, and a simmering desire for justice. The hardest part was reconciling the Richard the first knew with the man he had revealed himself to be. The Richard who had celebrated my birthday, who had comforted me during losses, who had shared laughter over coffee. He seemed like a stranger now, a ghost of a friendship I had treasured. And yet, the betrayal was real, the theft undeniable, and the consequences could not be ignored. I knew one thing with absolute certainty. I could not let this stand. Not just for me, but for the years of trust, the life I had built, and the principle that betrayal, no matter how cunning, cannot go unchallenged. The path ahead was uncertain, and the fight would be emotionally exhausting, but I had no choice. Richard had taken too much already, and I would not allow him to take any more. It happened slowly at first, almost imperceptibly, but then it hit me like a tidal wave, the full weight of Richard's betrayal. My financial security, painstakingly built over decades, had been stripped away, leaving me vulnerable in ways I had never imagined. Bills went unpaid, investments vanished, and the small comforts of my life, things I had taken for granted, began to slip through my fingers. The first call came from my accountant. "Eleanor," he said, voice careful, almost hesitant, "there are some serious discrepancies in your accounts. Some funds have been withdrawn without authorization. I think you need to take action immediately." I sat frozen, phone pressed to my ear, my vision narrowing as panic clawed its way up my chest. How is this possible?" I whispered, my own voice trembling. It was a question with no real answer, a question I already knew the answer to but was too terrified to accept. Richard. It was always him. The next days were a blur of phone calls, emails, and frantic calculations. I went through every account, every statement, every ledger, trying desperately to understand the scale of what had been taken. It was worse than I had imagined. He hadn't just siphoned a little money here and there. He had taken nearly everything. Every careful decision I had made, every saving I had painstakingly accumulated over decades, gone. I remember sitting at my kitchen table one night, the stack of financial statements towering over me like a wall, my hands shaking as I cradled my head. I wanted to cry, to scream, to do anything that would make the world stop spinning, but no tears came. Instead, a cold, suffocating numbness took hold. The life I had carefully planned was collapsing, and there was no one to blame but the man I had trusted most. I tried to reach Richard. I called, I texted, I emailed. At first, there were excuses, delays, assurances that he would make things right. Then came the silence. Weeks passed without a single reply. The man who had once been the constant in my life, the one I had believed would never let me down, had vanished when I needed him most. I began to feel the crushing weight of isolation. Friends and family tried to console me, but how could they understand the particular pain of betrayal by someone so close, someone who had shared your life for decades? They offered sympathy, practical advice, suggestions for legal action, but none of it touched the raw, personal wound that Richard had inflicted. Sleep became impossible. Nights stretched endlessly, filled with images of our past. Laughter shared over coffee, quiet talks in the living room, afternoons spent walking in the park. Every memory felt tainted now, every moment of trust replaced by the bitter knowledge of deception. I would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, reliving conversations, replaying moments, trying desperately to identify when it had begun. When the mask had slipped, when the man I thought I knew had revealed his true self. The financial crisis was only part of the pain. There was the deeper, more insidious wound of trust broken, of friendship weaponized against me. I found myself questioning everything. Every decision, every relationship, every instinct I had ever had. I had believed in Richard utterly, and now that belief had been used to strip me bare. One evening, I sat with my hands wrapped around a mug of tea that had long since gone cold. I thought about the years I had spent nurturing this friendship, investing not just money but emotional energy, love, and hope. And I realized something terrifying. Richard hadn't just stolen my money. He had stolen my sense of security, my ability to trust, my peace of mind. Tears finally came, silently without sound, carving paths down my cheeks as I stared at the wall. I allowed myself to feel the despair, to acknowledge the full magnitude of the loss. I let the grief wash over me, raw and unfiltered, because I knew that to ignore it would be to ignore the reality that I had been wronged in the deepest, most personal way imaginable. Yet even in that darkest moment, a flicker of determination ignited. I could feel it, faint but insistent, buried beneath the layers of grief and rage. I would not allow Richard to win. I would not let him take everything, not just for the sake of my finances but for my dignity, my sense of self, and the principle that betrayal cannot go unanswered. The next weeks were a whirlwind of preparation and planning. I contacted lawyers, compiled documents, and traced every transaction I could find. Every email, every bank statement, every financial record became a piece of evidence, a tool in my fight to reclaim what was mine. I began to understand the extent of Richard's deception in detail, and the scope of it only fueled my resolve. Anger became my ally. It was a sharp, relentless force that kept me focused, kept me moving when despair threatened to paralyze me. I channeled it into strategy, into meticulous planning, into building a case that could not be ignored. I thought of the Richard I had known, the man who had shared decades of friendship, and contrasted him with the man I now faced, a man who had betrayed with calculation and cold precision. The contrast stung, but it also clarified my purpose. I also began to consider the public dimension of my fight. Richard had built a life and reputation on charm, on trust, on the illusion of honesty. Exposing him would not be easy, but it would be necessary. I realized that my battle was not just about money. It was about accountability, about ensuring that such betrayal could not continue unchecked. And so, amidst sleepless nights and mounting anxiety, I began to formulate a plan. It would not be quick, it would not be easy, and it would demand every ounce of patience, courage, and tenacity I could muster. But I knew with a certainty that steadied me, that I would confront him, that I would expose the truth, and that I would reclaim what was rightfully mine. Every morning, I woke with a renewed sense of purpose. Every document I examined, every call I made, every detail I uncovered brought me one step closer to justice. The financial crisis that had initially felt like a crushing weight became, paradoxically, the catalyst for action. It forced me to confront the betrayal fully, to acknowledge the pain, and to transform that pain into resolve. I knew the road ahead would be treacherous. Richard was clever, charming, and resourceful, and I had no illusions about the challenges I would face. But I also knew something more important. The betrayal had awakened a strength in me I had never known I possessed. It had forced me to fight for myself, for my life, and for the dignity that had been threatened. And so I prepared, gathering evidence, consulting experts, and steel myself for the confrontation that would come. I could almost see it in my mind. The moment of reckoning, when the man who had betrayed me would finally be held accountable. That vision, fragile and distant though it was, became a beacon, guiding me through the storm of grief, anger, and uncertainty. By the end of that long, harrowing period, I felt a strange combination of exhaustion and empowerment. The financial crisis had stripped me bare, yes, but it had also clarified my purpose. I would confront Richard. I would expose his deception publicly. And I would reclaim my life, piece by piece, with dignity intact. Because I was no longer the same Eleanor who had blindly trusted. I was a woman forged by betrayal, sharpened by loss, and resolute in her pursuit of justice. And I would not stop until the truth was known, until the scales were balanced, until I had reclaimed what was mine. The day I confronted Richard publicly was etched into my memory like a photograph I could never forget. I had spent weeks preparing, not just gathering financial records, emails, and evidence, but preparing myself emotionally. The Eleanor who had once been naive, trusting, and completely dependent on friendship for reassurance was gone. In her place was a woman who had faced betrayal, had been stripped bare, and had forged herself anew in the fire of loss. I arranged a meeting, not in a quiet cafe, not behind closed doors, but in a public place where witnesses could see, where there could be no excuse, no manipulation. A local community hall, neutral and formal, where I could present my evidence clearly and forcefully. It was not about revenge. It was about justice. It was about reclaiming the dignity and security that Richard had stolen. When he arrived, he carried the same charm, the same smile that had once made me feel safe. But now it was empty, hollow, stripped of its power over me. I barely recognized the man in front of me, the man who had seemed larger than life, almost untouchable, yet was now merely a figure of deceit standing in the harsh light of truth. I began by speaking calmly, deliberately. "Richard, you betrayed me," I said, my voice steady despite the whirlwind of emotions inside me. "You took my money, my trust, and my peace of mind. You used what I gave you to build a life for yourself while I faced the consequences of your actions." The room was silent. A few onlookers murmured quietly, sensing the gravity of the moment, the tension hanging like a physical weight in the air. Richard's eyes flickered, betraying something he had long hidden, unease. For the first time, I saw a crack in his facade, a small tremor that betrayed the careful control he had always maintained. I presented the evidence. Every bank transfer, every unauthorized withdrawal, every manipulated document was laid bare. I spoke methodically, letting the facts speak louder than anger or grief. I had learned through this ordeal that fury could cloud judgment, that emotional displays, while cathartic, could weaken a case. I needed clarity, precision, and inevitability. As I went through the evidence, I felt a strange sense of liberation. The weight that had pressed upon me for months, the sleepless nights, the panic, the grief, began to lift slightly. It was replaced by something sharper, something more potent. Power. Not the power to harm Richard, but the power to reclaim my life, to assert the truth, to make him face what he had done. Richard attempted to interrupt at first, to charm, to deflect, to dismiss the mounting evidence. But I had anticipated this. I remained composed, my voice unwavering, my eyes fixed firmly on him. Each lie he told, each excuse he attempted, only served to reinforce the reality of his betrayal in the minds of those listening. "You think you can charm your way out of this?" I asked, my voice low but firm. "Do you honestly believe that decades of friendship give you the right to steal from me, to manipulate, to betray?" He flinched, though he quickly masked it with a forced laugh. But the damage was done. The truth had been revealed, the scales had been tipped, and there was no way to obscure the reality of his actions any longer. I could feel the room's attention shift, the collective recognition that what I was presenting was not a vendetta, but a factual account of deception and theft. Eyes widened as people saw the documents, read the numbers, and understood the depth of the betrayal. I wasn't just Eleanor the victim. I was Eleanor the survivor, the woman who had refused to be silenced, refused to be humiliated, refused to let betrayal define the rest of her life. By the time I finished, Richard was quiet. His charm had faltered, his excuses exhausted. The truth was undeniable. The life he had built on my trust, my loyalty, my belief in him had been laid bare. He could no longer hide behind smiles, laughter, or the weight of shared history. In the days that followed, legal proceedings began. The evidence I had painstakingly gathered formed the foundation of my case. Slowly, meticulously, my losses were recovered. Financial restitution came, not instantly, not without effort, but ultimately, justice prevailed. And with each step toward reclaiming what was mine, I felt a piece of the burden lift. But the real victory was not in the money. It was in the reclamation of self. I had been betrayed, yes, but I had also discovered a resilience I had never known I possessed. I had faced deceit, humiliation, and loss, and emerged not broken, but stronger, clearer, and more determined than ever. I reflected often on the irony of it all. Richard had thought he could manipulate me, exploit me, and leave me defeated. Yet it was precisely his betrayal that awakened a strength I had never tapped into. I had survived the unimaginable, faced the deepest wounds of the heart, and turned despair into action, grief into clarity, and betrayal into empowerment. Friendship, I learned, is sacred, but trust is not something to be given blindly. I had loved and trusted fully, and it had left me vulnerable, but it had also allowed me to confront the truth with unmatched clarity and courage. The pain was real, the loss profound, but so was the redemption. I never expected Richard to acknowledge what he had done. Some people never face the consequences of their actions fully. Some never feel remorse. That wasn't the point. The point was that I had reclaimed my life, my dignity, and my peace. The public exposure, the legal restitution, the undeniable facts, they were the instruments through which I restored what had been stolen. And in that restoration, I found a strange sense of closure. Not the kind that erases the past, but the kind that empowers you to move forward without fear, without lingering doubt, without the weight of betrayal pressing on your chest. I had been wounded, yes, but I had healed in the strongest way possible. Through truth, action, and unyielding courage. I often think of Richard now, not with anger or malice, but with a quiet acknowledgement of reality. He was a chapter in my life that brought pain, yes, but also clarity. He revealed not just the fragility of trust, but also the strength that arises when one refuses to be defeated. And so I move forward, older, wiser, and infinitely stronger. I cherish my relationships more carefully, value my own instincts, and have learned that true empowerment comes not from avoiding pain, but from facing it head-on. The betrayal by Richard was a wound that could have defined the rest of my life, but instead, it became the catalyst for transformation. I reclaimed what was mine, not just materially, but emotionally. I reclaimed my dignity, my confidence, my voice. And in doing so, I discovered a simple, profound truth. Life may betray us, people may fail us, but our strength lies in the courage to stand, to act, and to never let deceit dictate our story. I had trusted Richard once with everything, and he had failed me. But I did not fail myself. And that, ultimately, is what mattered. If this story touched your heart or taught you something valuable, make sure to like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring stories.